This week we'll begin working on the final project for writing assessment theory in practice. You're going to create materials for a course that involves writing at the college level. You'll then write a reflective essay where you cite writing assessment scholarship that we've encountered this semester to justify and explain the decisions that you made in those course materials that you put together. When I plan an assignment, it's tempting sometimes to leap into the prompt. I want students to write 2,000 words, and here's what I want them to write about. But I found that assignments come together much more easily, and I do a much better job of teaching an assignment if I think about the learning that I want students to take away by the time that they finish something. What do I want students to do or to know by the end of this assignment? That's really the question that I'm asking myself when I'm preparing an assignment. If I'm talking about preparing for a class meeting or even for a program, those are different questions. By the time students finish this Tuesday night's class, here's what I want them to learn. Or by the time a student finishes their degree, here's what I want them to learn. I'm thinking about the end point. Think about where you want students to end up, or what it is you want them to take away from something. Can help you articulate where you're going as a class, can help you explain the pieces of the class and how they work together. It can also help you cut a lot of clutter, busy work assignments that you thought were kind of important, but after kind of reflecting on the learning outcomes, there's really not a good justification for them. Get that out of the class. It just kind of distracts students from the important things, the learning outcomes that you put together. You can definitely keep goofy, tangential conversations about Taylor Swift, wheat thins versus Triscuits. Triscuits is the right answer, by the way. The merits of the Oxford comma. You can still keep all that stuff. But having learning outcomes helps you get on track much more easily and explain how the parts of the class are working together. Today, I'm going to talk to you all about how to write learning outcomes that are meaningful, accessible, and are equitable for students of different backgrounds. Talking about learning outcomes is something I do as Shawnee State University's Director of Assessment and Accreditation. I help faculty and staff members develop learning outcomes and then go out and assess those learning outcomes. For you all, today we're just going to talk about outcomes in the context of an assignment. But keep in mind that the stuff that I'm going to talk about can be applied to a class meeting, an overall class, or even an entire academic program. Learning outcomes are what you want students to do by the time they finish an experience. So in the context of this video and the final assignment for writing assessment theory in practice, what is it that you want them to know or do by the time they finish that assignment? The question for you to ask and to answer is, by the time students complete blank assignment, what should they know or do? The answer should be something that you think is important. It should be meaningful to you. It should be meaningful to students. So thinking about if you took composition pedagogy with Dr. Knudsen, that could be a really great place to start, because in that class you're learning a little bit about what the field thinks is important in teaching composition, a different way writing instructors go about teaching that. That could be an excellent place to start. What are the 2 to 4 things, and you can go a little higher, I don't think you want to go any lower, what are those handful of things that you want students to learn by the time they finish the assignment that you have in mind? Learning outcomes are usually action verbs that are concrete and something that you can see, something that is observable. That doesn't mean, however, that you should dumb down learning outcomes just so that they're super easy to see, like saying, well, I'm just going to make this assignment about APA format and I'm just going to count the number of citation errors. That, I would argue, doesn't really pass the meaningful test of a meaningful learning outcome. Are students really being challenged to learn there? No, they're being challenged to memorize something. It's not very rigorous. There's not a lot of learning that's going on there. They're just learning what's right and what's wrong when it comes to some format citation. You can see evidence of things like critical thinking, effective communication, ethical reasoning. Those things are tougher to assess. But in college, we're asking students to do a bit more. We're asking them to engage their minds a fair bit more. So thinking about how we can assess those things, it comes down to what does it look like when somebody has engaged with critical thinking, made an ethical decision, effectively communicated. What does that look like? And being able to capture that, that's a huge step into developing some powerful learning outcomes. You just need to think about, for your class, what does it look like? What are the things that you want students to learn? And then putting some language to that. So an action verb followed by what they should be able to do with that verb. Something like, in the context of writing assessment theory and practice, by the time students complete Rhetoric 6620, in the final project of 6620, they will design theoretically informed assessment practices. I can see that. I should be able to see a prompt that has elements of different things that we've talked about in this class, different readings. I should be able to see some influence of different readings on those course materials. Yeah, that's accessible. That would work. Another decent example, thinking about teaching first-year writing, students are going to integrate sources into their writing. Yeah, that definitely works as well. Here are the few of the do's and don'ts of writing learning outcomes, things to kind of keep in mind as you're developing your learning outcomes for the assignment that you're putting together. You want the learning outcomes to be an action verb with a specific task. You want the goals to focus on student learning, and you want them to be a good fit for the students that you're teaching. The learning outcomes for a first-year writing course and the first assignment for the first-year writing course should be different than the learning outcomes for the last assignment of the same course. And those should all be different than like a junior level course, a master's degree level course. They need to be a good fit for who you're teaching. Also, and probably most importantly, the learning outcomes have to be meaningful. You need to care about them. And I would argue that you need to persuade your students that they need to care about them as well. Like, get them invested in what it is that they're learning. So if you get data back saying that 38% of your students are unable to do this thing, that should get you fired up. Like, you should care about that. If I got data back saying 38% of my students had a sentence combining error in their essay, I'd be like, yeah, I guess. Be cool if we could fix that, but I probably have things that are far more important than that. Again, it needs to be something that you care about. Those are the do's of learning outcomes. Make them meaningful, make them appropriate for the students that you're learning, that you're teaching, and make them specific so that you can observe them. Give them a specific verb that you can observe. Those are the do's. Let me talk a little bit about the don'ts of writing learning outcomes. Avoid verbs like demonstrate and understand. Demonstrate usually implies another verb later down the line. I'll give you an example. Demonstrate the ability to write a thesis statement. Write a thesis statement. That's the learning outcome. Understand outcomes also don't work because they usually sell faculty short. We're usually wanting students to do something with that understanding. I'll give you another example. Understand the importance of citation styles. Cool. What do I want them to do with that understanding? If I can answer that, I'm probably on my way to a learning outcome. So avoid learning outcomes and begin with demonstrate or understand. Avoid describing content, products, or activities in the class in a learning outcome. I'll give you an example if that's a little bit confusing. Write a research paper as a learning outcome. That's not really the outcome. That's the product that you want students to provide you to show you that they learned something. Break that outcome down a little bit. Think about the learning that's really important to you that you want students to take away by the time they complete that assignment. Maybe something like explore a range of resources on a scholarly topic. That might be a better fit. Avoid learning outcomes that talk about quality or what we call indicators of quality. So telling students an outcome is something like communicate effectively through writing by developing and organizing ideas. Two problems with that. First problem is the quality level thing. Telling students that they're going to write effectively as a learning outcome, that's already kind of wading into the how well they're doing something. Your job in writing a learning outcome is just to say, here's what I want you to learn. Their final product is going to have a conversation about how well they did it. So don't confuse things and tell them, here's what I want you to learn, and here's how well I want you to learn it, all in the same place. Just say, I just want you to communicate effectively in a variety of contexts, or or whatever that you want to add there. But so the first problem with that learning outcome is this issue about including quality levels. The second thing that's wrong with it is the next do not do when writing learning outcomes, and that's to stack learning outcomes on top of each other. That is a very common thing because as teachers, we teach a lot. There's a lot of things that we're getting across to students. Not all of it is going to end up on a prompt or a rubric because it would be 3 or 4 pages long. And some people do that kind of thing when they evaluate student writing. I don't think that's particularly helpful or healthy. So keep things focused. Don't stack learning outcomes. Students are going to communicate through writing by developing and organizing ideas. Those are 2 or 3 different outcomes in that one outcome. Keep one action verb and keep it simple. Finally, avoid fuzzy outcomes. Appreciate comes to mind. I'm going to appreciate literature through this assignment. It's really hard to evaluate that. It's not to say that that's not something that students are going to pick up, an appreciation of a film or whatever. Students are going to get that. It's really hard to assess. It's also really kind of subjective. And I think it's unfair to students to say, you're going to do this appreciation and only I am going to be able to determine whether or not you've done it. Students should be able to kind of self-assess and determine whether or not they're making progress. And that appreciate thing, that's notorious for being something that only the instructor can ever see and ever understand. So yeah, avoid those squishy verbs, those kind of vague verbs. Why do learning outcomes matter? Why are they important to use? I think that they're important to faculty. I also think that they're important to students. So for faculty, I think learning outcomes matter, and they're important because they keep you focused. They keep you, they provide you that guidance that you need sometimes when things get turned around in a class. And if you've never taught before and you're going to be teaching writing in the next few months, there's going to come a time where you get turned around, where you're like, I had this plan for the class and it all went to hell. Like that happens. It just does. It's part of the process of being an educator. It still happens to me, and I've been teaching for nearly 20 years now. Having learning outcomes are the thing that kind of like you pick your head up and say, what do I do with this class? Those are the outcomes. That's where I want to get them to. Where are we? And then developing a plan to get them there. That's that's one reason learning outcomes are really important for faculty. They're also important for faculty just from a time management issue. When you've got a stack of papers to grade, and you have no learning outcomes, you have no set of priorities that you provided students, the things that you're looking at, you're on the hook for commenting on everything. A student could expect that, like, well, you didn't tell me what this is about, so I guess you're going to be just commenting on everything. No way. There's not enough time for that. Identifying those handful of things that are important to you, that you want students to learn, that are important for students to learn, focus on those things. So when I grade student writing, I might comment a little bit on paragraph development, even if it's not necessarily a learning outcome for a particular assignment. But I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it if I've got 2 or 3 other issues that I think are more important for that assignment. I focus on those more important things. And it just saves me a lot of time. Learning outcomes are also important to students because they're transparency. They provide some transparency to the class. It also helps students understand what it is that they're learning, and that they can feel more invested in that process because they know what the goal is. I think sometimes it helps with motivation when I explain to students, like, this is where I want you to be. There's a lot of things that I could be looking at, but in this assignment, I'm really looking at these 2 or 3 things. They're not easy things; they're tough things, but they focus on them, and they can retain that a little bit better than if you just say, like, this assignment's about these dozen about these dozen things that I'm going to look for when I grade them, that's tough. So transparency is an important reason why I think learning outcomes are important for students. It also kind of gets into this like bait and switch that sometimes happens when faculty will say, I'm going to grade this assignment based on this, or I'm just going to base it on something really kind of loose and flimsy, like how persuasive it is, without kind of articulating how you're going to look at or define persuasiveness. That can be a real bait and switch for students. So you say it's about persuasiveness, but then you kind of say, well, I can't possibly give a student a good grade if they have a comma splice. Well, you never told students that that's what the assignment was about. So, if you want grammar and things like that to be an important part of the assignment, make it a learning outcome, I guess. I would argue that there are probably more important things that you could be teaching them. But you make that transparent to students, and then you don't bait and switch. If you say that critical thinking, integrating sources, and organizing ideas, these are the three things that are really important for this assignment, you stick to it. And you look for those three things. It saves you a lot of time. If you do it well, you're going to gain the trust of students and say, you know what, I noticed that there were these other issues that came up. We're going to work on that for the next assignment. That really helps, I think, with trust with students, but then also kind of like keeping things focused and kind of being kind to yourself so that you're not commenting on a ton of things when you are ultimately evaluating student writing. So this has been a very long video about learning outcomes. You all are going to put together learning outcomes for a potential assignment, and so I wanted to see you guys integrate some of these ideas into those learning outcomes. I'm looking forward to seeing them. I'm super excited to see where your guys' assignments go. So I'll talk to y'all soon.